If I told you the Romans basically had their own version of the internet, you would probably laugh. No Wi-Fi, no smartphones, no fibre optics, right? But the more you look at what they actually built, the more it starts to feel uncomfortably familiar. They had systems that moved information, water, heat, people, even waste all through networks that connected millions of lives every day. If you've ever felt proud about living in the most advanced era in history, this episode might sting a little. We are going to walk through some of the technologies Rome mastered 2,000 years ago that still make our modern solutions look a bit embarrassing. Let us start with one of the greatest flexes in engineering history, how they moved water. When the Romans needed to bring fresh water into their cities, they did not just dig a couple of wells and hope for rain. They designed and built enormous aqueduct systems that turned gravity into a public utility. Imagine stone and brick channels stretching for more than 50 miles, threading their way across valleys, hugging hillsides, gliding into cities on lines so precise that a modern surveyor would nod in approval. These were not cute little streams. Some aqueducts carried hundreds of millions of gallons of water every day. To keep all that water from leaking away, the Romans mixed their own waterproof cement, a volcanic lime-based brew that has outlived empires. While we patch cracks in bridges every decade or two, their channels are still clinging to hillsides and marching across open countryside. The wild part is how simple the core idea was. No electric pumps, no diesel engines, no control panels. It was just physics and human effort. You find a clean water source in the hills, you give the channel a tiny steady slope and you let gravity do the heavy lifting. But here is the catch: that slope has to be almost perfect. Too steep and the water rips the structure apart. Too shallow and the flow slows to a trickle or stops completely. So Roman engineers spent years running calculations, measuring angles with nothing but sighting tools, strings and geometry. A mistake of a few inches over miles of stone could ruin the whole project. Yet again and again they nailed it. Those long lines of arches you see in pictures are not just pretty architecture. They are the spine of a system tuned down to fractions of a degree. And this was not just for show. That water did serious work. It rose up into multi-story apartment buildings. It poured into enormous public baths where thousands of people soaked every day. It exploded out of monumental fountains that doubled as both decoration and neighborhood water taps. In some cities, the constant flow even helped keep streets cleaner than you might expect from an ancient metropolis. All of this was operating at a time when large parts of the planet were still figuring out basic plumbing. For many communities, a water system meant a bucket and a nearby stream. Rome, by contrast, was running a city-wide network of water lines, distribution tanks, and managed supply channels. It is hard not to look at that and think, okay, maybe we are not as special as we thought. The best part: they intended these systems to last. And they did. Some aqueducts are still working today, still delivering water along almost the same paths, still using almost the same materials laid down when toga-wearing engineers first opened the flow. That is 2,000 years of service without a single software update or replacement of circuit boards. The level of precision and long-term thinking behind those water highways would make modern project managers sweat. Every arch had to carry the right load. Every foundation had to handle centuries of erosion and earthquakes. But the Romans were not just obsessed with getting clean water into the city, they also had to deal with what happened after people used it. Because once you have hundreds of thousands of citizens washing, bathing, cooking, and, well, living, you end up with a whole different problem. What do you do with all the dirty water and waste? Most ancient cities try to ignore that question. Waste piled up in streets seeped into wells and bred flies and disease. Rome took a different path. Underneath the marble temples and markets, they built one of the most important and least glamorous systems in their world, the Cloaca Maxima. The name sounds elegant in Latin, but it basically translates to the really big drain. This gigantic sewer system started humbly as a simple drainage ditch to stop the Roman Forum from turning into a swamp every time it rained. But being Romans, they refused to leave it at that. Over time they widened it, deepened it, roofed it over, and turned it into a vast underground network of stone tunnels that could swallow both rainwater and human waste from across the city. The main tunnel was so big that ancient writers joked you could row a boat through parts of it. Some stretches were over 12 feet wide and more than 10 feet high, built from enormous stone blocks cut and fitted together without a drop of mortar. The arches they used were so perfectly shaped that the weight of the city above pressed the stones tighter instead of breaking them apart. And here is the incredible thing. Large chunks of that system are still functioning today, 2,000 years of floods. Earthquakes, wars, and modern construction have passed overhead, and yet the Cloaca Maxima is still quietly doing its job, carrying away stormwater and runoff, like it has since the days of Rome's early kings. Beyond the engineering flex, the sewer solved two life-and-death problems at once. First, it gave heavy rainwater somewhere to go, which meant the city stopped flooding every time clouds rolled in. Second, it moved waste away from densely populated neighbourhoods so it did not sit there rotting in the summer heat. That made Rome, for all its chaos and crowding, healthier than many cities that came after it. The outlet emptied straight into the Tiber River, which, yes, was bad news for people living downstream, but for the Romans, packed into the city centre, it was a game changer. Their big underground drain became the blueprint for urban sanitation systems all over the empire, and centuries later it would inspire modern engineers trying to tame the waste of industrial-age cities. So before Rome even got to heating buildings, powering machines, or pouring magic concrete, they had already done something crucial. They had wired their world for water. Clean water in, dirty water out, all handled by systems that still whisper under modern streets. Keeping a stone building warm in winter is a problem even with modern insulation and glass. Now imagine trying to do it with nothing but brick marble and open courtyards. Instead of everyone shivering under animal skins, Roman engineers solved the problem with a system that would put a lot of modern central heating to shame. It was called the hypocaust, and it turned entire buildings into giant, slow-breathing radiators. The idea sounds almost too simple. Start with a furnace room tucked to one side of the building, fill it with wood or charcoal, light it up until the air inside is roasting hot. Then instead of letting that heat vanish straight up a chimney, trap it and push it under the floors and into the walls. No wires, no digital thermostats, no fans or control panels, just heat moving naturally from a fair through carefully designed spaces. Inside the building, the floors did not sit directly on the ground. Workers raised them on dozens or even hundreds of short stone or brick pillars, each one about the height of your shin. That created a hollow space under every room. From the furnace, hot air and smoke flowed into these hidden cavities, spreading out beneath the entire floor. The thick tiles above soaked up the warmth and slowly released it upward, so anyone walking inside felt heat coming from their feet rather than just from an open flame. Walls could be part of the system too. Builders sometimes left narrow vertical channels inside them so that hot air could rise along the interior. As the air climbed, it heated the brick and stone, which then radiated warmth into upper rooms. A two-story home could enjoy comfortable temperatures on every level, all driven by a single firebox at one end of the structure. The brilliance of this design was how quietly it worked. No rattling equipment, no sudden blasts of hot air, just a steady, even warmth that turned cold stone halls into places where you could actually relax. The temperature depended mainly on how much fuel slaves fed into the furnace and how well the flues were designed. Once the system was running, it needed very little adjustment. Public buildings took this idea to a whole new level. Bath complexes used massive hypocausts to create entire zones of climate. One room might be mildly warm, the next hot enough to make you sweat, and another almost steamy. Thick walls, layered floors, and vaulted ceilings trapped and guided the heat. Pools in some areas stayed pleasantly lukewarm, while others turned into intense hot baths that felt like natural element rings. Inside a large bath complex, you could walk through a carefully planned journey of temperature and sensation. Step into a cool entrance hall to wash off dust. Move slowly into warmer chambers to let your muscles loosen. Finally enter the hottest room where the floor warmed your feet and the air felt dense and heavy. Steam rose from pools while conversation bounced off marble and mosaic. These places were not just about getting clean. They were social hubs where almost everyone gathered. People did business deals, met friends, exercised, listened to readings, or simply sat and people watched. The heating system made it all possible. Without it, those giant stone rooms would feel like caves in winter. With it, they became comfortable public living rooms for the entire city. The fuel demand was huge, which meant the system had to be efficient. Furnaces were designed in such a way that almost every bit of heat had a purpose. The hottest air warmed the floors first. As it cooled slightly, it moved through other spaces to squeeze out a bit more warmth before finally drifting upward and out through vents. Even the building layout helped move heat around with corridors and doorways guiding air like gentle currents. What makes the hypercore so impressive is how long some of these arrays kept working. In certain places, remnants of the original system still show soot stains and heat discoloration. Archaeologists can trace exactly where the hot air flowed and how often certain rooms were heated. The bricks and tiles are often scorched on one side while perfectly preserved on the other, an ancient record of long-gone fire. Wealthy families sometimes installed smaller versions of this technology in their private villas. Imagine waking up on a cold morning and stepping onto a floor that feels gently warm instead of icy. No portable heaters cluttering the room, no smoke hanging under the ceiling, just a clean, quiet warmth rising through the stone. For the upper class, that was daily life. There is also a clever safety element hiding in the design. Since the fire stayed in a separate furnace room, the risk of open flames tipping over inside the main living spaces dropped dramatically. Smoke mostly stayed out of the occupied rooms, drifting through underfloor spaces and wall channels instead. It was not perfect, and air quality around the furnace could be terrible for the workers feeding it. But for the people enjoying the baths or lounging in villas, it meant less choking smoke indoors. The same principle that made the hypocore so effective is still used in many modern systems. Radiant floor heating, where hot water runs through pipes beneath your floor, works on almost the same idea. The main difference is that modern systems rely on pumps and electricity, while Roman versions counted on gravity-rising hot air and the skill of builders who had no digital tools at all. The scale of some of these complexes remains astonishing. Think of an area large enough to hold multiple swimming pools, gym spaces, gardens, libraries, and long rows of changing rooms, all kept comfortable by one integrated heating system. Fire rooms sat at the edges, often several of them working together with teams of labourers continuously hauling fuel and managing the flames. Above their heads, thousands of citizens soaked in hot water or lounged in warm rooms without ever seeing the hard labour that made that comfort possible. From an engineering perspective, the hypercourse shows a kind of thinking that pops up repeatedly in Roman technology. Take a basic natural principle like hot air rising, then build an entire system around it that scales from a single house to a huge public complex. Do the calculations, lay the bricks precisely, and let the physics do the heavy lifting day after day. That mindset of using simple physical rules to solve big problems appears in many corners of Roman life. Heating, water supply, building, support, even sound control in some theatres all follow the same pattern. The tools were basic, but the designs were anything but primitive. Looking at the remains of these systems today, it is hard not to feel a little humbled. With all the modern devices, screens and code, it is easy to forget how much can be achieved simply by understanding how heat, air, water and stone behave. The hypercore stands as proof that a cleverly designed network of bricks and empty space can feel just as magical as any high-tech system buzzing quietly behind a modern wall. Running water did more than just fill fountains and baths. Once Roman engineers realized moving water carried energy, they began treating rivers and streams like endless power supplies. Instead of just watching currents rush past, they built machines that turned that force into motion that never got tired, never asked for pay, and never needed a lunch break. The star of this quiet revolution was the water wheel. Not the decorative little wheels you might see in a garden, but towering wooden frameworks that could stand as tall as a 2-story building. These wheels sat beside rivers or canals where the current was strong. Look at one in motion and you would see paddles dipping into the water, turning the wheel in a steady hypnotic rhythm. At its simplest, the system worked like this. Flowing water hit the paddles and pushed them forward. That rotation turned a central axle, and that axle connected to gears or shafts that drove other machines. Grain mills were some of the most common applications. As the wheel turned millstones inside a building, rotated, grinding wheat into flour for bread. One wheel could feed an entire district, grinding day and night as long as the water kept moving. Roman engineers experimented with different designs to squeeze as much power as possible out of each drop. An undershot wheel sat low in the river, so that the current swept under it and pushed the paddles from below. This design was easy to build and worked well in fast-flowing streams. But they also developed overshot wheels where water flowed from above into buckets or paddles near the top of the wheel. In that setup, gravity added its own pull to the force of the moving water. Overshot wheels could achieve impressive efficiency, converting a large portion of the water's energy into mechanical work. For ancient wooden machines built without modern metal tools, they were remarkably capable. The design meant that even modest streams or canals could drive heavy equipment, as long as engineers could lift the water high enough to pour it onto the top of the wheel. The uses went far beyond grinding grain. In some places, water wheels drove saws that cut timber into planks for building projects. In others, they powered heavy hammers for metalworking, smashing, and shaping iron for tools, weapons, and construction. There were also wheels turning mechanisms that crushed olives for oil. That oil lit lamps, flavoured food, and treated wounds, so the machines that produced it had an impact in almost every home. Each installation demanded careful planning. Builders had to study the river's speed, depth, and seasonal changes. Too little water and the wheel would stall. Too much force and fragile wooden parts could shatter. They adjusted paddle size, wheel diameter, and gear ratios to get a smooth, reliable motion that could run for years with only minor repairs. Along some rivers, clusters of mills turned entire stretches of water into industrial zones. Imagine walking along a bank and hearing a constant mix of creaking wood, splashing water, grinding stone, and shouted instructions. These were noisy, busy places, where raw materials arrived on carts and left as finished products. Labourers hauled sacks, adjusted mechanisms, and watched for problems while the water did most of the heavy lifting. The concept behind the water wheel might feel simple today, but in the Roman world it represented a shift in thinking. People were no longer relying only on their own muscles or animal power to do heavy work. They were beginning to tap the forces of nature directly. The idea that a river could be turned into a kind of engine, quietly reshaped how food was produced and how materials were processed. Many centuries later, the same basic idea would grow into full-scale hydroelectric power plants with giant turbines spinning inside concrete dams. The principle stayed the same. Use moving water to turn something. Use that turning motion to drive whatever work you want. The Romans did not generate electricity, but in their mills and workshops you can see the first steps toward that future. The materials that held these machines together mattered just as much as the designs. That is where another Roman strength shows up clearly. While gears and shafts needed wood and metal, the buildings that sheltered them needed something stronger and more adaptable than simple stone. That something was Roman concrete, a material that behaves so well in harsh conditions that modern engineers still study it. At first glance, concrete seems like a straightforward mixture. Take a binder, mix it with aggregates, add water and let it harden. Modern construction relies on Portland cement that begins to weaken after some decades. Roman builders worked with a very different recipe. Across much of Italy they had access to volcanic ash. By mixing this ash with lime and water, then adding pieces of stone and brick, they created a blend that set hard and kept getting tougher over time. What makes this mixture stand out is how it reacts with its environment. In many places, Roman concrete structures have been sitting in seawater for nearly 2,000 years. Waves crash against them, salt seeps in, modern concrete in the same conditions often cracks and crumbles. Roman piers and breakwaters in contrast remain solid, their cores still dense and stable. Inside that ancient concrete, a slow chemical dance has been unfolding for centuries. When seawater penetrates the porous surface, it reacts with the volcanic components in the mix. That reaction forms tiny crystals that grow inside small cracks and voids. Those crystals effectively stitch damaged areas back together. The material does not stay frozen in time. It changes and heals, becoming stronger as ages pass. Using this supercharged stone paste, Romans created arches, vaults and domes that stretched farther and rose higher than traditional masonry allowed. One of the most famous examples is the Dome of the Pantheon in Rome. It remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Layer by layer, builders poured and shaped the structure so that the mix became lighter toward the top. The result is a vast open interior crowned by a single uninterrupted curve of hardened volcanic concrete. Harbours benefited from the same genius. Builders poured concrete under water by lowering wooden forms filled with the mixture. Once it's set, those submerged blocks became foundations for walls and piers. Ships could dock safely behind strong barriers that tamed rough seas. Trade thrived, in part because those harbours did not fall apart with every storm. Bridges and aqueduct supports showcased another strength of the material. Concrete cores covered with stone facing created solid, long-lasting crossings that stayed stable as riverbeds shifted. In some places, modern traffic drives over foundations laid by Roman hands. The original builders never imagined cars and trucks, yet their work continues to carry that weight. Producing this concrete required no electric mixers or motorized pumps. Workers shoveled ingredients by hand, stirred them in large basins, and carried the heavy wet mixture in baskets. The intelligence of the system did not live in machines. It lived in the formula and in the understanding of where and how to use it. The combination of water, power, and long-lasting concrete let Roman communities build in ways that were both ambitious and practical. Mills, warehouses, bath complexes, bridges, and ports all benefited from these advances. The physical remains of those projects have outlived the empire that created them, still standing in landscapes that have changed many times over. Imagine looking at a massive lake that keeps flooding good farmland and deciding the best fix is to punch a tunnel straight through a mountain. No power drills, no dynamite, no modern surveying gear, just pickaxes, chisels, and a lot of geometry. That is exactly the challenge Roman engineers took on with the Fucine Lake project in central Italy. The lake sat in a closed basin with no natural outlet. Every time the water level rose, fields and villages around the shore suffered. Instead of giving up on that land, Roman planners treated the entire lake like a problem to be solved. The plan sounded simple on paper. Cut a tunnel through the surrounding mountains, give the lake an artificial drain, lower the water level, and turn swamp into farmland. The numbers tell the real story. The main tunnel stretched for more than 3.5 miles through solid rock. To build it, crews had to dig down from the lakeshore, then push horizontally through the mountain until they reached the other side. Along the route, they sank dozens of vertical shafts from the surface, creating access points where teams could attack the rock from multiple directions at once. Each shaft acted like a chimney for air and a doorway for tools and workers. The deeper the tunnel went, the more important those openings became. Without them, the air underground would have quickly turned stale and suffocating. With them, smoke from oil lamps and dust from constant hammering could escape upward instead of choking everyone below. Alignment was the real nightmare. The engineers could not just guess and hope. They needed the tunnel to come out at exactly the right level on the far side so that water would flow steadily without blasting through like a runaway river. The slope had to be gentle. Too steep and the outlet would erode itself apart. Too shallow and the water would sit there stubbornly, refusing to move. To get it right, surveyors worked with simple instruments like sighting rods, plumb lines, and levelled beams. They measured from multiple points, checked and rechecked angles, and calculated the path using geometry that would make a lot of modern students rub their temples. Crews dug from both ends toward the middle. When the faces finally met underground, the error was surprisingly small considering they were working by torchlight in cramped rock tunnels. Life for the workers was brutal. Many were prisoners, slaves, or forced labourers. Day after day they chipped away at the mountain with iron tools surrounded by dust noise and the constant threat of collapse. Wooden supports held the ceiling in place where the rock was unstable. When groundwater seeped in, they had to bail it out or channel it away to keep the workface dry. The project took years of continuous effort. It demanded coordination between thousands of people: engineers, overseers, labourers, cart drivers, hauling rock away carpenters, building supports, and metal workers, sharpening tools. For the people commanding the work from comfortable positions above ground, it was a statement of power as much as an engineering challenge. It showed that nature itself could be reshaped if enough planning money and manpower were thrown at it. Once the tunnel opened and the lake began to drain, the shoreline receded, and new land emerged ready for cultivation. There were problems later with maintenance blockages and politics, but in terms of pure engineering ambition, the tunnel stands as a remarkable achievement. It turned an entire landscape into a kind of hydraulic machine that answered to human plans instead of seasonal floods. The methods developed for this project did not stay in one place. Roman builders used similar techniques to drive tunnels for mines, to carry water through hills along aqueduct routes, and to push roadways through hard terrain. Ventilation shafts, drainage galleries, and careful slope control became standard tools in their underground toolbox. Long before modern tunnel boring machines chewed through bedrock, Romans were already solving the same physical problems with hand tools and mathematics. Working underground was only one way they played with three-dimensional space. Another clever solution shows up in how they handled vertical movement inside tall structures. Space inside urban buildings was precious. Wide, straight staircases ate up valuable floor area that could be used for rooms or storage. Roman architects found a smarter answer that packed climbing routes into tight cores while still keeping them comfortable to use. That answer was the spiral staircase, and at first glance it just looks like a series of steps wrapped around a central column twisting upward like a stone screw. Look closer and you realise how much thought went into every piece. Each step had to be cut with a specific angle so that the staircase rose at a steady rate while wrapping in a consistent spiral. Get that angle wrong and the stairs become either dangerously steep or annoyingly shallow. The central column did more than just hold the pattern together. It carried a lot of the weight from the steps and the people walking on them. Each tread was often keyed into the column on one side and anchored into the outer wall on the other, turning the entire structure into a stable stone helix. Without any steel reinforcement or modern fasteners, the geometry itself provided strength. Buildings that used spiral staircases gained a huge advantage. Towers could rise several stories without devoting big rectangular chunks of space to stairs. Light could be brought into central shafts from above, turning the whole climb into a softly lit vertical corridor. Because the steps wrapped closely around the central axis, the staircase felt enclosed and secure rather than exposed. Trajan's column in Rome offers a famous example. Inside that tall commemorative monument, a spiral stair climbs all the way from the base to the viewing platform near the top. Visitors move upward in a gentle curve with small windows cut into the outer wall to let in glimpses of the city and enough light to see. The exterior shows a swirling band of carved scenes, while the interior quietly hides a perfectly functioning vertical street. Spiral stairs were not just about convenience and style. They also carried subtle practical advantages in military buildings. In narrow towers and fortified structures, defenders positioned above had an easier time swinging weapons at attackers forced to climb in a confined spiral. Right-handed soldiers climbing upward would find their sword arms cramped against the central column, while defenders above them enjoyed more freedom of movement. Whether every Roman architect consciously planned that effect is up for debate, but later castle designers definitely took advantage of it. From a design perspective, spiral staircases show the same Roman habit of turning simple observations into refined technology. People needed to move between floors, space was limited, straight runs made life difficult. Wrapping the steps around a strong core solved all of that in one move. Once builders perfected the proportions and learned how to cut the stone consistently, the forms spread through towers, lighthouses, monuments, and multi-story apartment blocks. Climbing one of these ancient stairs today, you feel the same rhythm of step turn that feet have followed for centuries. The treads might be worn smooth by countless shoes and sandals, but the geometry still holds. Every part of the structure works together without visible joints or metal hardware. It is another reminder that for Roman builders, space was something to be sculpted in all directions. Horizontally with roads and tunnels, vertically with columns and stairs, and diagonally with ramps and spirals that guided the movement of people and water alike. Picture a vineyard at harvest. Baskets of grapes piled high, purple juice staining hands, and tunics the air thick with sweetness and buzzing insects. Crushing all that fruit by foot or by hand would take forever. Roman engineers looked at that problem and did what they always seemed to do. They turned a messy chore into a powerful machine. The device at the heart of this change was the screw press. At first glance it looks simple. A sturdy wooden frame, a heavy pressing plate, and a massive screw rising out of the centre. The magic lived in the way that screw turned human effort into incredible pressure. The basic setup went like this. Workers loaded grapes or olives into a woven basket or a circular trough. They slid the basket under the pressing plate that hung from the big wooden screw. A long horizontal bar or a set of handles attached to the top of that screw. When workers pushed the bar around and around, the screw rotated slowly. Every turn moved the pressing plate downward a tiny amount, but with tremendous force. This is where the genius showed up. The screw transformed a gentle push on the handle into crushing power. One or two people could create pressure that would have taken a whole crowd to match by stomping. Each rotation squeezed more juice out of the grapes or more oil out of the olives than simple pressing ever could. Wine production changed dramatically. Instead of wasting juice in the skins and pulp presses wrung almost every drop out of the harvest. That meant more wine from the same amount of land. For olive oil, the stakes were even higher. Oil was not just for flavour. It lit lamps, treated wounds, and softened skin. Households needed a steady supply. The screw press turned that need into a manageable process rather than a constant struggle. There was a rhythm to press work. Fill the basket, lower the plate weight as the liquid ran into collecting basins, then loosen the screw fluff, the crushed material, and press again. Workers learned how much force the frame could handle without cracking. They listened to the creaks and watched for the first drip of juice to change into a steady stream. The materials were a balance of strength and availability. Oak or other hardwoods formed the frame and screw. Iron fittings reinforced key joints and kept parts from splitting under extreme stress. Craftsmen carved the screw threads carefully so they would mesh smoothly with the supporting nut below. If the threads were too rough, the press would jerk and stick. If they were too shallow, the system lost power. Some presses were used in small family farms. Others stood in large estates or communal facilities where entire villages brought their harvest. Archaeological sites show rooms dedicated to pressing with channels carved into the floor to guide juice or oil towards storage jars. The smell inside those spaces in full operation must have been intense, a mix of crushed fruit, sweat, and wood shavings. The screw press also shows how well Romans understood the idea of mechanical advantage. Without equations on paper, they still designed machines that multiplied human strength through clever geometry. Turning a long handle in a circle felt manageable, but the screw turned that smooth circular motion into a powerful downward force on the pressing plate. It is the same basic principle behind modern clamps, car jacks, and industrial presses. This technology did more than boost production numbers. It shaped landscapes and economies. Regions that grew olives or grapes could now support larger populations and export more goods. Cooks had more oil to work with. Merchants had more wine to trade. Religious rituals that burned oil or poured wine as offerings had a more reliable supply, all because someone realized that a rotating screw could change everything about how people squeezed liquid from fruit. While presses worked to extract value from harvests, another quiet Roman innovation helped people decide when to start those harvests. Timekeeping might sound simple today. Phones, watches, and clocks crowd every room. In the ancient world, knowing the time accurately once you left a city centre was much harder. Romans came up with a pocket-sized answer that did not need gears or springs. Portable sundials were that answer. Rather than relying only on large public monuments, some Romans carried small metal or wooden devices that turned sunlight into a personal clock. These objects were not random circles scratched with lines. They were carefully calibrated instruments that required real mathematical effort to create. Designers first had to understand how the sun's path changed with the seasons. The angle of the sun in summer is different from its angle in winter. It also changes with latitude. A sundial that works perfectly in Athens will give wrong readings in northern Gaul. Roman craftsmen compensated for this by adjusting the layout of hour lines and the position of the little pin or rod that cast the shadow. One version of these devices folded into sections. Open it to a certain configuration that matched the city or region you were in, then suspend it by a string or hold it level. A small gnomon, the part that cast the shadow, popped into place. When the sun hit it, the shadow fell across marked lines that told the time. Other versions were simple discs where the owner had ordered a custom design matched to a particular latitude. Using a portable sundial took practice. You needed a clear view of the sky and enough understanding to orient the device correctly. The reward was independence from fixed city clocks. A travelling merchant could pace the day, arrange meetings and plan journeys without constantly searching for a public time marker. A soldier on the move could coordinate with others more precisely than just guessing from the sun's height. The workmanship on these objects often reflected the status of their owners. Some were plain and functional. Others carried engraved decorations, inscriptions, or even small scenes. The combination of utility and beauty made them both tools and fashion statements. Pulling a sundial out in a social setting sent a subtle message. The owner valued precision, had enough education to read the device and enough wealth to commission it. The most interesting detail might be accuracy. When properly made and used, some of these sundials could match or outperform early mechanical clocks that arrived centuries later. They did not tick in the dark, but in daylight they offered a surprisingly reliable guide for daily schedules, religious observances, and business agreements. A pocket sundial asked nothing from its owner except careful handling. No winding, no replacement parts, no fuel. Sunlight was the only requirement. On cloudy days, of course, it became useless, which is why many people still relied on water clocks or public timekeepers inside cities. Yet the existence of these portable devices shows how seriously Romans took the concept of organised time. Together with presses that multiplied force and clocks that fit in a hand, everyday life gained new layers of structure. Farmers knew better when to pick and crush their crops. Traders could arrange meetings with more confidence. The flow of work, harvest, and travel followed not just the rough arc of the sun across the sky, but measured hours that people could point to and share. Organising time helped people plan their days, but Romans also cared about how those days looked and felt. Mealtimes especially were a big deal. Dinner was not just putting food in your mouth, it was a performance, a social signal, and a quiet brag about taste and status. Clay bowls from the local market were fine for everyday use, but when hosts wanted to impress, they reached for something far more refined. That something is what archaeologists now call Samian ware. Think of it as the luxury table set of the Roman world. At a glance, these pieces stand out immediately. The surface shines with a rich glossy red so smooth that it almost looks like it has been dipped in wet paint. Bowls, cups, plates, and serving dishes all carried that same polished look, turning a simple meal into a small display of craftsmanship. The secret was in this clay and the firing process. Potters used fine, carefully sifted clay to avoid lumps and impurities. Before firing, they coated the surface with the thin, liquid clay slip that would fuse into that famous smooth finish. Without electric kilns or digital thermometers, they had to control the temperature using only experience and constant attention, adjusting fuel and airflow to hit the exact window where the clay hardened and the surface transformed. Inside a working kiln, the heat was intense. Flames licked around stacked vessels. Smoke curled upwards, and the potters watched colour changes through small openings. They knew that a shift from dull red to bright orange meant the temperature was climbing into the right range. Too hot and everything could warp or crack. Too cool and the slip would not bond properly, leaving a dull, weak surface. Hitting that narrow target again and again required real talent. Decoration pushed the artistry further. Many Samian pieces carry crisp relief patterns along their sides. Mythological scenes, animals, leaves, and geometric borders wrap around the bowls and cups. Craftsmen pressed wet clay into moulds carved with these designs, then attached the decorated panels to vessels before firing. It was like stamping art into the very skin of the pottery. What makes this tableware even more impressive is how tough it turned out to be. Families used these dishes every day. They held hot food, cold drinks, and everything in between. They got knocked against other pots stacked in cupboards and probably dropped more than once. Yet many pieces survive with only minor chips, their surfaces still gleaming after 2,000 years underground. Some modern plates do not last a single kitchen remodel without scratching or cracking. Potters were proud of their work and left their mark on it. Makers stamped their names or workshop symbols into the clay, usually on the base or inside the rim. These signatures now act like labels for archaeologists who can track how far specific workshops shipped their goods. A shard of Samian discovered in Britain might carry a stamp from a factory in central Gaul, proving that Roman trade routes reached deep into provincial towns and forts. The distribution of this pottery is like a heat map of Roman influence. Wherever legions settled, merchants soon followed, bringing boxes of red tableware to sell. Soldiers in remote outposts could eat off the same style of dish as citizens in fashionable Italian cities. That gave the empire a sense of shared culture that went beyond language and law. You might be far from Rome, but the bowl in your hand reminded you that you were still part of its world. Even broken fragments tell stories. Layers of discarded pottery in an ancient rubbish pit can show when a neighbourhood prospered and when it struggled. A sudden drop in high-quality imports suggests economic trouble or shifting trade patterns. A surge of fancy decorated pieces hints at a period of wealth or military spending. All of this insight comes from something most people would have thrown away without a second thought. While dinner tables flashed with red gloss, another Roman innovation quietly transformed how heavy things moved. The challenge was simple to understand and hard to solve. When you slide something heavy across a surface, friction fights you. The bigger the load, the harder it drags. Wooden beams, stone blocks, and metal parts do not like to budge once they are resting on flat supports. Roman engineers noticed what everyone today learns in childhood. Rolling makes movement easier than sliding. Logs under a stone block let it glide forward with far less effort. The trick was turning that basic observation into reliable mechanisms that worked inside machines and ships, not just under sledges. The solution that emerged looked remarkably like the ancestor of modern bearings. Instead of letting surfaces scrape directly against each other, builders inserted rows of cylindrical rollers between them. Those rollers could be made of hardwood or bronze, carefully shaped, so they would turn smoothly as the upper structure moved. Friction turned from a dragging force into a gentle rotation. Some of the most famous examples came from the giant ships built for Emperor Caligula on Lake Nemi. These vessels were not simple transport boats. They were more like floating palaces, complete with elaborate decorations, tiled floors, and heavy fittings. Steering platforms, winches, and even large rotating features needed to move without tearing themselves apart. To handle those loads, Roman craftsmen installed roller bearings in critical spots. Imagine a massive rudder or a large capstan having to turn with precision. Between the fixed frame and the moving part, they set short bronze cylinders arranged in a ring. When someone pushed the handle or pulled a rope, the upper section moved and the rollers spun under it, letting the whole assembly rotate with far less resistance. The same principle found its way into other heavy equipment. Cranes that lifted stone blocks used rotating drums and pivots that benefited from roller systems. Huge doors in important buildings could swing more smoothly on their axes. Anywhere that two parts needed to move relative to each other, under serious weight, a layer of rollers could make the difference between a mechanism that creaked and jammed and one that felt almost effortless. From a physics standpoint, nothing about these bearings required complex formulas. What mattered was understanding the advantage of rolling contact and knowing how to shape and place the rollers. Yet that simple change opened the door to more ambitious designs. Once you can move heavy loads easily, you can think bigger with your ships, your cranes, and your building components. The durability of these pieces is striking. Some bronze rollers have been recovered from shipwrecks after centuries at the bottom of lakes, still smooth enough to recognize their roll at a glance. The metal has darkened, but the shape and polish on the working surfaces make it clear how they once performed. They were not decorative trinkets. They were precision parts that lived inside the hidden skeleton of complex machines. Modern life rests on the same idea. Car wheels, bicycle hubs, factory conveyors, and spinning hard drives all rely on bearings to keep friction under control. The shapes and materials are more advanced now with hardened steel balls and sealed casings, but the underlying concept is unchanged. Put something round between moving surfaces and let it turn instead of drag. Seeing that concept already in action in Roman shipyards and workshops gives a different perspective on ancient technology. It reminds us that progress is not just about flashy inventions or glowing screens. Sometimes it is about noticing that one way of moving feels easier than another, then turning that feeling into hardware that works day in, day out under weights most people never see. Moving stone, water, and people around a city took genius, but one more Roman achievement often hides in plain sight. It did not sparkle like polished pottery or tower like a marble temple, yet it connected everything. It was the reason messages turned into orders turned into action, and action turned into empire. That achievement was the Roman road and communication network, a kind of physical internet stretched across 3 continents. Think about the scale first. By the height of Roman power, there were tens of thousands of miles of engineered roads linking cities' forts, ports, and frontier outposts. These were not dirt tracks carved by years of footsteps. They were constructed layers of gravel, stone, and compacted earth sitting on carefully shaped foundations. The surfaces shed water rather than turning into mud. That alone put them ahead of many modern rural roads during bad weather. The way those roads were built followed a consistent pattern. Surveyors walked ahead with instruments, choosing routes that balanced directness with practicality. They preferred straight lines when possible, but did not fear cutting through hills or spanning valleys with bridges. Once the route was set, crews dug a trench, filled it with rough stones for drainage, added a middle layer of smaller rocks and gravel, then finished with tightly fitted paving stones or compacted gravel on top. Drainage was not an afterthought. Ditches ran along the sides to collect rainwater. Slight curves and slopes guided water away from the centre so it did not pool and damage the roadbed. That attention to water management is why some stretches of Roman paving still show clear outlines today, while much younger roads have crumbled. Every so often milestones rose along these routes. These carved stone markers did more than tell travellers how far they had gone. They often listed who built or repaired that section and under which ruler. Each marker became a tiny announcement of order and authority. Anyone walking past could see that the road was not just a path, it was a state project. For ordinary people, good roads meant easier travel with carts and animals. For the Roman government, they meant something much more powerful. Messages could now move at speeds that would astonish most ancient societies. Mounted couriers could cover long distances in relatively predictable time. That reliability created a new kind of control over far-off regions. To support these messengers, Romans organized a system of relay stations known as the cursus publicus. Think of it as a chain of rest stops and service hubs stretched along major routes. At these stations, riders could swap tired horses for fresh ones, rest briefly, hand off messages, or pick up new instructions. Official dispatches carried by government couriers moved with priority backed by imperial authority. The process looked something like this. A letter or order started in a city office, sealed and handed to a certified courier. That rider left the city at a gallop, following the main road to the first station. There he swapped mounts, grabbed a quick drink and continued. Throughout the day and into the night, the message kept moving from horse to horse and sometimes from rider to rider. By using relays instead of a single exhausted man and animal, the system kept a steady pace that could cover hundreds of kilometers in a surprisingly short time. From a modern perspective, this starts to look familiar. There is a central hub where information begins, main routes that carry those packets of information outward, and smaller branches that deliver them to specific destinations. Instead of fiber optic cables, there were roads. Instead of electric signals, there were riders and scrolls. The logic is similar. Get information from one point to another as fast and reliably as the available technology allows. Security and trust mattered too. Official correspondence often bore special symbols or passes that proved they were part of the system. Station masters knew who was allowed to use government horses and supplies. Misusing these resources could bring serious punishment. That kept the network from turning into a free ride for anyone who happened to show up with a story. For the emperor and his administrators, this network was like an extended nervous system. Trouble on the frontier could be reported quickly. Tax information, legal decisions, and military orders travelled along the same routes. Without dependable ways to move messages, an empire that large would have fractured under its own weight. The roads and relay stations stitched distant provinces into something that could be managed from a capital many days away. Merchants benefited as a side effect. They had more predictable travel times, safer routes patrolled by soldiers, and knowledge that news of bandits or political shifts would spread along the same channels. If a border closed or a local governor changed the rules, rumours did not take months to filter through. The same paths that carried official orders also carried gossip, business information, and personal letters. On market days in distant towns, traders might discuss grain prices in one region or the arrival of a new governor in another. Those conversations depended on the steady flow of messengers and travellers along the road system. Information moved in waves as people carried what they had heard from one station to the next, turning miles of stone into a network of stories and updates. Maintenance kept the system alive. Roads wore down under constant traffic. Stones shifted, bridges cracked. Local communities, soldiers or enslaved labourers were assigned to patch and rebuild sections. The fact that so many stretches remain visible today suggests that repair work was not rare. It was constant and organised, another reminder that the infrastructure was not treated as a one-time project but as an ongoing responsibility. Walking down a surviving Roman road now can feel strange. Under your feet is a design meant for sandals, hooves, and wooden wheels. Yet the straightness, the drainage, and the sense of direction still feel modern. In many regions, later roads copied the same routes because the Romans had already found the best path through the landscape. Modern communication satellites and fibre lines may seem like a completely different world. Still, the same basic questions remain. How do you connect distant places quickly? How do you make sure information gets where it needs to go? How do you keep the system running year after year? Roman roads and their messenger network answered those questions with stone sweat and horsepower. They turned geography into something that could be crossed on a known schedule. They turned a scattered collection of lands into something that acted like a single entity. Even without screens or digital signals, that achievement feels surprisingly close to the challenges people try to solve with technology today. Raising heavy stones on ropes looks easy in paintings. In real life, one misstep and a block of marble bigger than a small car comes crashing down. Yet Roman cities filled their ski lines with multi-story temples, arches, and stadiums that needed thousands of those stones placed exactly right. That did not happen by sheer muscle alone. It happened because Roman engineers built machines that turned awkward back-breaking lifting into something that almost looked graceful. At the heart of this system were cranes. Not the steel giants that swing over modern building sites, but wooden frameworks of beams, ropes, and pulleys anchored into solid foundations. A basic Roman crane might look like a tall A-frame or a single vertical mast with angled supports. At the top, a wheel or block held ropes that ran down to a hook. The clever part was not the wood. It was the way they used pulleys and tread wheels to multiply human strength. Start with pulleys. Anyone who has lifted a bucket on a rope knows that pulling straight up is tiring. Run that rope through a wheel, and you can stand at a distance and pull downward, instead using your body weight more effectively. Add a second wheel and route the rope back and forth, and each pull lifts the load a shorter distance but with less effort. Roman builders stacked these advantages. They arranged multiple pulleys in combinations that let a small crew lift stones that would otherwise be impossible. Then they added tread wheels, and everything changed. A tread wheel looks like a gigantic hamster wheel made from wood. Workers climbed inside and walked forward, turning the wheel with their weight. As the wheel rotated, it pulled on ropes wound around an axle, raising the load. One or two people inside a properly designed wheel could replace teams of men hauling on ropes, and they could do so in a more controlled, continuous way. Imagine the scene at a big construction site. A crane stands beside a rising wall, its base firmly anchored. A stone block waits on the ground with the ropes already tied. The signal is given. Inside, the wheelworkers begin walking. Slowly, steadily, the stone lifts off the ground and rises. On the upper level, masons guide it into the place using smaller ropes to adjust angle and rotation. The crane operator watches everything, ready to stop or reverse if something looks wrong. No engines, no hydraulic fluid, just muscle power running through carefully designed machinery. Roman engineers did not rely on guesswork to decide what their cranes could handle. They understood that every beam and rope had a limit. Overload a crane and it could snap, killing workers and delaying the project. Surviving depictions and descriptions suggest that builders calculated safe load ranges using practical rules developed over time. They chose strong timbers, used thick ropes twisted from tough fibers, and spread forces across frames so that no single joint took all the strain. Cranes were not limited to temples and monuments. They showed up in shipyards where hulls needed heavy components lowered into place. They worked in quarries, lifting cut stone blocks onto carts. They stood near city walls to hoist materials up to defensive platforms. In busy ports, simpler versions loaded cargo from piers into ship holds and back again. Each time the same basic principles applied. Use pulleys and wheels to turn human motion into vertical lift. What makes these machines especially impressive is how easily they could be assembled, used, and then taken apart. Unlike permanent stoneworks, cranes were mobile assets. Builders could move them as a project advanced, raising new sections of wall or adjusting to different heights. When construction finished, the wood could be reused for other purposes. In that sense, cranes behaved like tools rather than monuments. They did their job quietly and left very few obvious traces. The legacy of this lifting technology appears in subtle ways. Later builders in medieval and early modern periods used very similar treadwheel cranes, especially on cathedral projects. The slow, steady pace of a wheel-powered lift gave workers the control they needed when placing delicate stonework high above the ground. In some places, the wooden housings of later cranes still cling to the tops of towers, reminders that big ideas in construction always rest on the same basic challenge: how to move weight. Lifting stones answered one question. Another challenge waited inside the finished structures: How do you handle tens of thousands of people at once without chaos? For that, Roman designers turn their attention to something that looks strangely familiar to anyone who has attended a modern sports event crowd flow. The Colosseum in Rome is famous for its scale and its gladiatorial contests, but its internal design might be its most remarkable feature. The building could hold around 50,000 spectators in tiered seating. Getting that many people in and out of the structure quickly and safely demanded more than a few big doors. It required a blueprint for movement. Architects solved this with a network of corridors, staircases, and entrances that worked like a living diagram of crowd control. Dozens of archways formed entry points at ground level. Above them, vaulted passageways circled the arena, connecting to radial corridors that led directly to seating sections. Numbered markers guided spectators to the correct areas. Once inside, ramps and stairs directed people upward or sideways without forcing them to cross against opposing flows. The effect was something close to what we might call analog user experience design. People did not need detailed instructions. The shape of the building and the placement of openings nudged them along efficient paths. When the games ended, the same design allowed the Colosseum to empty in a surprisingly short time. Thousands of people could leave without crushing bottlenecks or confusion, each following a clearly defined route back out to the city streets. Beneath the arena floor, another level of organization operated. A maze of corridors, cages, lifts, and trapdoors supported the spectacles above. Animals and performers waited in holding areas. Mechanical hoists lifted cages and platforms up into the arena. While the crowd roared and watched staged hunts or dramatic scenes, teams of workers below coordinated timing and movement with careful precision. Safety and control played a role in this design, even if the events themselves were often brutal. Gateways that led to the arena floor could be locked or opened quickly. Barriers separated performers from spectators. Officials had elevated paths to reach different sections fast. All of this relied on clever placement of doors, stairs, and passages that allowed some people to move freely while limiting others. From a technological standpoint, this is less about gadgets and more about systems thinking. The Colosseum functioned as a machine for experiences. Stone and concrete formed the structure, but the true innovation was in how people moved through it. Every arch, stair, and corridor played a role in managing crowds, directing attention, and maintaining order. The same logic shaped other large public structures. Theatres, circuses, and stadiums throughout the Roman world used similar circulation patterns. Cities learned how to site these buildings so that crowds did not clog key streets. Planners placed markets, bath complexes, and entertainment venues in locations that balanced access with space, and urban version of load balancing. Put cranes and crowd flow together and a pattern emerges. Roman engineers were not just solving isolated problems. They were building systems that extended from quarries to construction sites to completed venues filled with people. Machines lifted stones into place. Designs guided visitors along intended paths. Knowledge about how materials behaved under load, how ropes and pulleys multiplied strength, and how humans reacted to stairs and corridors all combined into a kind of soft technology that shaped daily life. Urban life in the Roman world did not look like a scattered collection of little huts. In the biggest cities, it felt more like living inside a stone machine, one designed to stack people's shops and services on top of each other in ways that feel surprisingly modern. If you walked into a busy Roman neighborhood at its peak, you might recognize more than you expect. Start with housing. Not everyone lived in a villa with gardens and fountains. Most city residents packed into multi-story apartment blocks called insula. Some of these rose 4, 5, even 6 floors high. They lined crowded streets with shops on the ground level and cramped living spaces stacked above like ancient versions of mixed-use buildings. Construction techniques had to keep up with this vertical ambition. Builders used a mix of brick, stone, and concrete to create strong load-bearing walls. Wooden beams stretched between those walls to carry the floors. Light and air were constant challenges, so many insulae wrapped around small courtyards. These open spaces brought sunlight into the centre of the building and gave residents somewhere to breathe that did not involve dodging carts in the street. On the ground floor, shop fronts opened directly onto sidewalks. Bakers' taverns, barbers and small merchants worked out of the narrow units with wide doorways. At night, shutters closed across those openings, turning the entire building into a protective shell. Above the shops, windows peeked out from living quarters. They were not just empty holes. In wealthier areas, panes of glass filled those openings, softening wind and rain while still letting light in. Roman glassmakers had figured out how to produce relatively clear window glass by blowing and flattening molten material. The pieces were not perfectly transparent the way modern glass is, but they were good enough to brighten dark rooms and cut down on drafts. Some privileged homes even experimented with double glazing, placing 2 layers of glass with a small gap between them to improve insulation. It is the same basic idea behind many modern energy-efficient windows. Inside apartments, life revolved around small rooms arranged off narrow corridors. Families cooked on portable braziers, stored water in jars brought up from neighbourhood fountains, and slept on beds pushed against walls. Space was tight, so furniture stayed simple and often doubled up on function. A chest for storing clothes might also serve as a bench. Hooks and shelves on walls kept belongings off the floor. Water and waste systems threaded through these buildings in clever ways. Fountains in the street delivered clean water from aqueducts. Residents carried it upstairs in pitchers and buckets. At the same time, some insulae connected to shared latrines or had simple vertical shafts that dropped waste down into collection pits or sewers below. It was not hygienic by today's standards, but it showed a clear attempt to separate living areas from refuse. Fire was a constant danger in such dense construction. Wooden floors, cooking fires, and oil lamps in cramped spaces made accidents almost inevitable. Roman authorities responded with regulations and organised fire brigades. They set rules about maximum building heights in some cities and specified materials for certain parts of construction. In Rome, a force known as the Vigiles patrolled streets at night, mixing the roles of firefighters and watchmen. When flames broke out, they arrived with buckets, pumps, hooks, and even blankets soaked in water to smother smaller blazes. The efforts did not prevent all disasters, but they showed that the city was treated as an interconnected system. A fire in one building threatened an entire block, so controlling it became a public responsibility, not just a private worry. Access to water at key points, open spaces that could act as fire breaks and routes wide enough for crews to move through, all played roles in this early version of urban risk management. Beyond housing, Roman planners experimented with large-scale complexes that combined many functions under one roof. A striking example is the structure often called Trajan's Market in Rome. Rather than a simple row of stalls, it was a multi-level complex cut into a hillside with curving corridors lined by shop units, offices and storage rooms. Concrete and brick vaults created strong fire-resistant ceilings overhead. Windows and openings at the back let in natural light from the slope, keeping interior spaces from feeling like caves. Walking through such a complex in its prime would have felt a lot like moving through a modern shopping centre or office block. Different levels offered different kinds of goods and services. Stairways and ramps connected floors. Wide corridors managed foot traffic. The design itself guided visitors along routes past a variety of stalls, encouraging them to linger and look. Even without glowing signs and music, the architecture nudged economic behaviour. Business inside these spaces relied on another set of quiet technologies. Traders and officials needed ways to record deals, track inventory, and keep accounts. For that, Romans turned to tools that might look low-tech but worked incredibly well: wax tablets and the abacus. A wax tablet was a reusable note. Craftsmen carved a shallow recess into a wooden board and filled it with a layer of wax. Writing on it involved a stylus, a pointed metal or bone instrument. The sharp end scratched letters into the wax. The flat end could smooth the surface again when the text was no longer needed, erasing it so the tablet could be used again. Several tablets could be bound together, like pages, creating a compact portable notebook. Merchants carried these tablets to jot down orders, prices, and debts. Lawyers used them to draft arguments. Teachers wrote lesson notes for students. The ability to quickly record and erase information without wasting materials turned the wax tablet into something that feels a lot like an early handheld device. It fit in one hand, could be wiped clean, and went wherever its owner did. Counting and calculation relied heavily on the abacus. The Roman version often consisted of a board with grooves or wires along which beads or small counters slid. Each row represented a different unit of value. Moving beads left or right translated directly into addition or subtraction. With practice, users could handle fairly complex sums quickly and without writing out long strings of numerals. Together, the wax tablet and abacus supported an information economy built on speed and flexibility. A shopkeeper could tally a purchase total on the abacus note, the amount owed on a tablet, and erase it clean once payment arrived. Tax collectors could track income and obligations on the move. Military paymasters could manage lists of names and amounts in the field. All of this paperwork fed into a larger culture of record keeping. Governments maintained archives of decrees, census records, and legal decisions. Private citizens stored contracts, wills, and business correspondence. The codex, an early form of the book where pages were bound along one side, began to appear as an alternative to scrolls. Turning pages forward and backward to find a passage proved more convenient than rolling and unrolling long sheets of papyrus. These tools did not come with glowing screens or wireless connections, but they addressed similar needs. People needed to take notes, do math, store information, and retrieve it later. They needed to carry their data from place to place. Roman solutions used wood wax and beads instead of silicon and glass, yet the underlying problems they solved feel very familiar. Inside an insula, a shop or a multi-level market, you would find the same pattern repeating. Structures and systems were designed to make everyday tasks a bit easier, a bit more organized, and a bit more predictable. Apartments stacked people efficiently. Glass softened the weather. Fire brigades limited disaster. Markets concentrated goods. Tablets held records. Abacuses made numbers manageable. Step back from the details, and the picture that emerges is not just of grand monuments, but of a society quietly building its own version of interconnected, information-rich city life. Cleanliness in Roman cities was never just about splashing water on your face and calling it a day. It was a full-scale experience that blended engineering, architecture, social life, and even medicine into a single daily ritual. At the centre of this world stood the public bath complex, a kind of combination spa, gym, library, and networking lounge that relied on layers of technology working together behind the scenes. From the outside, a major bath complex rose like a palace of stone and brick. Massive arched windows, tall columns, and broad courtyards announced that this was not a place only for elites. Ordinary citizens could walk through the same doors as senators, paying a small fee, or sometimes no fee at all, depending on local rules and wealthy sponsors. Inside carefully planned spaces guided visitors through a sequence of sensations. The path usually began in the apoditerium. The changing room. Benches lined the walls and niches or shelves held clothes and belongings. Attendants watched over these spaces, something like early locker room staff. Walls often carried painted scenes, patterns, or inscriptions that turned a practical space into a decorated one. Voices echoed under vaulted ceilings as people greeted friends, argued about politics, or arranged business deals. From there, bathers moved into the frigidarium, the cool room. Here, large cold pools waited in halls lit by high windows. Marble steps slipped under the waterline. The air felt fresh, often cooler than the streets outside, especially in summer. Builders used thick walls and careful orientation to keep this area naturally chilled, without any mechanical refrigeration. The cold plunge helped wake up the body-tightened skin and set the stage for the warmer rooms ahead. Next came the tepidarium, the warm room that acted as a stepping stone between cold and hot. This space often became the social heart of the complex. Warm but not stifling, it allowed people to linger, sit on heated benches and chat. Engineers balanced temperature by adjusting floor and wall heating channels, creating a very specific climate that encouraged conversation. Traders shared news, teachers met students, and negotiators floated proposals while reclining on stone seats that radiated a gentle warmth. Deeper inside, the caldarium delivered a blast of heat and steam. Its pool shone under a high ceiling, sometimes with an opening that let in a shaft of sunlight and allowed steam to escape. Water here felt almost scalding. The hypercaust below drove hot air under the floor and up through wall flues, turning the room into a kind of stone sauna. For many visitors, this was where muscles finally unwound and sweat washed away the strain of a long day. Heating so much water and space demanded serious coordination. Furnaces burned constantly in service areas at the edge of the complex. Slaves or hired workers shoveled in wood-monitored temperature and checked flues. Aqueduct lines fed cisterns that stored incoming water at different levels. From those reservoirs, channels directed water into boilers, fountains, and pools. Gravity handled most of the movement. Pressure came not from pumps, but from the height difference between storage tanks and outlets. Water rarely took a simple path. Hot baths needed continuous inflow to stay clean and warm, while overflow ran out through the drains that connected to sewers. Cooler pools might receive mixed water from different sources, blending used water with fresh flows in ratios that savoured resources while still feeling pleasant. The overall effect felt effortless to the visitors, even though it rested on a complex choreography of inlets, outlets, and temperature zones. Beyond the bathing rooms, other spaces added layers to the experience. Many large complexes included palestre open courtyards for exercise. Men wrestled, boxed, and practiced ball games there before washing off sweat inside. Porticos surrounding these courtyards offered shaded walkways where older visitors could stroll, talk, or simply watch the activity. Their baths functioned as an early wellness centre where physical training connected directly to recovery and relaxation. Libraries sometimes occupied quiet corners of these complexes. Scribes and scholars stored scrolls in cabinets while readers sat on benches or steps to study. The warm and stable indoor environment made these spaces comfortable. Gardens added another dimension with trees, fountains and sculpture turning outdoor courtyards into little pockets of calm. A visitor could move from a noisy street into a sequence of carefully designed environments that soothed the senses. Lighting design played a bigger role than it might seem. Large windows placed high on walls let in natural light without sacrificing privacy. Clerestory openings near ceilings washed the interiors with soft daylight that bounced off pale plaster and marble. In the evening, oil lamps filled niches and hung from brackets. There were flickering flames reflected in polished surfaces and still water. Architects knew how to shape and direct light to create specific moods in different chambers. Sound shaped the experience as well. Builders understood that surfaces and ceiling shapes affected echoes. High curved vaults in large rooms created a rich resonant atmosphere where conversation blended into a background murmur. Narrower side rooms and smaller pools offered quieter spaces. Moving through the baths meant constantly shifting soundscapes from lively chatter to hushed whispers, the gentle splash of water. Social rules governed behaviour inside. Men and women often bathed at different times or in separate wings. Slaves and freedmen mixed with citizens, though services and access could differ by status. Still, the baths created more social mixing than many other public spaces. People who would never meet in a private home might sit side by side on a heated bench discussing news or simply enjoying the same pool. Medical thinking intertwined with these rituals. Physicians recommended bathing as part of treatment for various conditions. Specific sequences of hot, warm and cold exposures were thought to balance the body. Massage rooms attached to some baths offered oil rub-downs where trained hands worked out stiffness before or after time in the pools. The combination of temperature shifts, cleaning and muscle work provided a genuine health benefit, even if the exact theories behind it differed from modern medicine. All of this required steady funding and management. Cities or wealthy patrons covered building and maintenance costs. Fees from visitors, rentals of attached shops and donations helped pay for workers and fuel. Officials oversaw the complex, making sure water supplies remained reliable and that rules were followed. When something broke, repairs had to be made before major sections became unusable. In practical terms, the bath solved several problems at once. They gave people access down to hot water and cleansing facilities that most homes could never provide. They reduced dirt and sweat in crowded streets by giving citizens a place to wash regularly. They channeled social energy into a setting where deals could be made and news shared and tensions eased. All this while showcasing the city's engineering prowess through glowing marble, flowing water and perfectly controlled warmth. Imagine leaving such a place on a cool evening. Your skin feels clean, your muscles loose, your mind buzzing from conversations and glimpses of familiar faces. Behind you, furnaces still roar, channels still whisper water along their roots, and heated floors still hold the day's stored energy. The building lives on through the night, a carefully tuned instrument of comfort and connection, ready to welcome another wave of visitors the next morning. When people picture Roman power, they often think of soldiers in shining armour, not the quiet technology that kept those soldiers alive and effective. Yet behind every victory stood an invisible machine made of tools, habits, and clever engineering. The Roman army did not just fight with swords and shields. It fought with measuring rods, shovels, pulleys, and standardized procedures that turned chaos into something predictable. One of the most impressive examples appears every time a legion stopped for the night. They did not simply throw down blankets and sleep where they stood. They built a camp. Not a random scattering of tents, but a carefully planned fortified mini-city that could rise in a single afternoon on almost any patch of ground. Start with the layout. Surveyors walked the chosen site with tools like the Gromer, a simple cross-shaped instrument with hanging plumb lines. It allowed them to lay out straight lines and right angles with surprising accuracy. Using this, they marked the main streets, the centre space for the commander, the locations of gates and the rows for tents. The pattern stayed consistent from place to place. Soldiers from different units could arrive at a new camp and immediately know where to go, because the plan was always the same. Once the lines were marked, tools came out. Legionaries carried more than weapons. Their kit included shovels, picks, and baskets for dirt. In what looked like organised chaos, men began digging a ditch around the perimeter, piling the soil inward to form a rampart. Wooden stakes or prefabricated fence pieces went on top, forming a protective barrier. Within a few hours, a previously open field became a defensible enclosure complete with straight streets, assigned tent plots and guarded gates. From above, such a camp would look like a grid, a portable town that could be folded up and moved with the army. The regularity was the key. It kept movements inside the camp efficient and made nightly setup almost automatic. Units knew their positions, commanders knew exactly where to place watch posts and how to respond if an alarm sounded. The engineering here was as much about people as about earth and wood. Permanent forts took the same principles and scaled them up. On frontiers along rivers or artificial walls, rectangular fortresses with rounded corners anchored Roman control. Their walls combined stone or turf with wooden towers. Interiors followed that familiar grid: barracks, granaries, workshops, stables, and headquarters arranged along straight streets. The forts worked like hubs in a network, supporting patrols and acting as storage points and communication nodes. Inside these installations, another set of technologies kept the engine running. Granaries were particularly important. A hungry army does not stay an army for long. Roman granaries used raised floors and thick walls to keep grain dry and protected from rodents. Air could flow under and around stored sacks or piles, reducing moisture and spoilage. In colder regions, these buildings helped keep food usable through winter months when supplies could not easily be moved. Supply chains feeding those granaries stretched far. Harvests from fertile provinces travelled in bulk along roads and rivers. Grain might be loaded into standardized containers like amphorae clay vessels marked with information about origin, contents, and owners. Stacks of these amphorae in warehouses formed a physical database of the empire's food reserves. Officials could inspect the marks and know where a shipment came from and who was responsible for it. In port cities, huge storage complexes held imported food and equipment. Rows of dolier giant ceramic jars sunk into floors stored liquids like wine and oil. Wooden barrels and sacks filled with dried goods lined shelves and corners. Moving this volume of material required coordination. Workers used ramps, simple cranes and pulley systems to lift cargo off ships, lower it into storage, and then string it back out when needed. On campaign, the logistics got even more impressive. A marching column did not wander blindly. Scouts measured distances, identified water sources, and checked terrain for obstacles. Quartermasters calculated how much grain and fodder would be needed, how many animals to bring and when to resupply. Legionaries might carry several days of rations, but beyond that, the army depended on a steady flow of carts, pack animals, and local purchases or requisitions. To make this flow sustainable, equipment had to be standardized. Soldiers carried similar gear, which made replacement and repair easier. Shields, helmets, and weapons often came from centralized workshops that produced items in large quantities. Armorers in the field knew what parts fit which pieces. That consistency meant less time spent improvising and more time spent fighting or building. On the battlefield, engineering knowledge showed up in a different form. Roman commanders thought in lines, angles, and distances. They arranged troops in formations that acted almost like moving structures. The testudo, where soldiers held shields overhead and at the sides to form a protective shell, turned a group of individuals into a single armoured shape that could advance under missile fire. Other formations spread out or condensed depending on terrain and an enemy behaviour. Siege warfare turned the enemy's walls into engineering problems. Legions brought or built machines like ballistae and onagers that hurled stones and bolts at defenders. These devices relied on twisted ropes or sinew to store energy. Craftsmen had to understand tension leverage and the material's limits. They calibrated angles and distances through trial and error until they could hit targets reliably. Towers on wheels rolled toward fortifications, their upper levels lined with archers and soldiers ready to drop bridges onto enemy walls. Ramps of earth and timber rose gradually from the ground up to wall height, allowing troops to attack at the same level as defenders. Protective sheds covered workers as they advanced, shielding them from arrows and stones while they dug or built. All of this construction was done with limited tools, yet the planning behind it rivaled some modern project management. Siege camps ringed cities with their own fortifications, supply lines and living spaces. Diagram it on paper, and you would see layers of defences, supply depots, artillery positions and movement corridors, all organised to reduce risk and increase pressure on the besieged. Signal systems added another layer to military communication. Fire beacons placed on hills and towers could relay simple messages across long distances. A single lit beacon might mean danger in one region. Using combinations of light positions and prearranged codes, more detailed information could sometimes be sent, although this required skilled operators and clear weather. In coastal areas, similar signals warned of approaching ships or summoned help. Within shorter distances, trumpets and horns carried orders across noisy battlefields. Each call had a specific meaning: advance, retreat, change, formation, or hold position. Soldiers trained to recognize these sounds so that groups could respond even when they could not see their commander. The result was an army that moved like a single organism with mechanical and acoustic tools connecting its parts. Medical care in the field drew on specialized instruments and knowledge. Surgeons attached to legions carried kits with scalpels, forceps, probes, and even early versions of surgical clamps. These tools, often made of bronze or iron, were shaped with an understanding of anatomy gained from experience. While their methods could not match modern standards, organized treatment of wounds meant more soldiers survived and returned to duty. Taken together, military technology in this world looked less like a collection of flashy gadgets and more like a tightly integrated system. Camps, forts, granaries, roads, siege engines, signals, and medical gear all fit into a larger pattern. Each piece supported the others. Without the ability to build and organize rapidly, battles would be lost before they began. Without steady supplies and standardized equipment, even the bravest soldiers would falter. The real achievement was not just in any single device. It was in the way planners, engineers, and soldiers treated movement, shelter, food, and information as parts of one big problem, and then solved that problem with wood, stone, iron, and carefully practiced routines. Power in the Roman world did not only sit in weapons or walls. A huge part of it sat in something much quieter, something you could hold in one hand or carve into stone. Information. Who owned what? Who owed what? Which rules applied, and what time it was for everyone? To keep that information stable across a massive territory, Romans turned writing, money, and timekeeping into technologies just as important as aqueducts. Take coins for a start. At first glance, they're just bits of metal that help you buy bread. Look closer and they start to look like tiny data packets moving through the system. Roman mints took gold, silver, and bronze and turned them into discs stamped with images and messages. On one side, maybe the head of the current emperor. On the other, symbols of victories, buildings, or promises. Every coin carried a broadcast. It told people who was in charge, what the ruler wanted to be known for, and what standard of weight and purity the state claimed to guarantee. In a world without printed newspapers that mattered, a soldier in a frontier fort, a merchant in a provincial town, and a farmer in a village market all handled the same designs. Even if they never saw Rome itself, their daily transactions reminded them of the central authority. The technology behind coinage was simple but strict. Officials oversaw mints where metal was melted, poured, and cut into blanks. Those blanks were then struck between engraved dies using heavy blows from hammers. The images and inscriptions had to be clear enough to discourage forgeries. Weights needed to stay within tight limits so people would trust that a denarius or sestertius really contained the metal it claimed to. Trust was the main product here. Once people believed the coins were reliable, trade became easier. You no longer had to weigh every little piece of metal in every deal. You could simply count coins. That saved time and reduced arguments. It also let the state pay soldiers and workers in a standard form that could circulate widely. Those payments then flowed into markets, taxes, and savings, binding the economy together. The same mindset shows up in how Romans used stone and metal surfaces as permanent message boards. Laws, treaty agreements, building dedications, and even lists of citizens could be carved into durable materials and set up in public places. An inscription on a city wall or in a forum became a statement that could not be easily altered. Anyone who could read Latin or Greek could verify what it said without relying on memory or rumour. This public posting of information acted as an early form of open data. New rules were not supposed to stay secret. They were meant to be seen. In some cases, legal texts were copied in multiple cities so that regional officials and citizens shared the same reference points. If a dispute arose, people could point to the inscription and argue from the actual words rather than from vague recollections. In many cities, archives backed up what was carved outside. Officials stored written records on papyrus or parchment rolled into scrolls or bound in early codices. Decrees, tax records, land titles, and legal decisions all piled up in rooms dedicated to documentation. These archives turned government from something personal and flexible into something more organized and predictable. Once a decision was written down and stored, it could be consulted, cited, and compared to later decisions. Books as physical objects were also evolving. Scrolls were still common, but the codex format gained popularity. Instead of a single long sheet rolled around a stick, multiple sheets were stacked and bound along one edge. That allowed readers to flip directly to a section, hold a place with a finger, or collect several texts in one volume. For scriptures, legal codes, and technical manuals, this format offered huge advantages. Copyists sat in workshops copying texts by hand. They worked from exemplars, reading a line, writing it out, and repeating the process for hours. Errors crept in, of course, but the act of copying itself spread knowledge outward from major centres. A philosophical work or a military manual that began in one city might end up in libraries across the empire. The speed of spread was slow by digital standards, yet it was far faster and more consistent than oral transmission. Libraries gathered these scrolls and codices into organised collections. Shelves and pigeonholes filled with labelled texts turned rooms into information reservoirs. Scholars, officials, and curious citizens could consult these deposits when they needed guidance on history, law, medicine, or philosophy. The catalogue systems were basic compared to modern classification, but even simple grouping by author or subject made retrieval easier than fumbling through random piles. Control over time itself became another area where Roman innovation shows up. Before regular calendars and standardized days, local traditions often dictated when festivals, markets, and official business occurred. That chaos caused real problems for a large administration. Imagine trying to coordinate tax deadlines or military campaigns if every region used a slightly different year length or festival schedule. The Roman calendar went through messy phases with political manipulation and irregular adjustments until a major reform locked it into a more stable pattern. Once that system took hold, the year became something everyone could share. Months had fixed lengths. Leap years kept seasons aligned with dates. Official business could be scheduled years in advance with reasonable confidence that spring would still be in spring and harvest in harvest. This standardized calendar fed into daily rhythms. Courts met on set days, markets followed repeated cycles, festivals had fixed dates that tied communities together year after year. Even ordinary people who never read the calendar directly felt its influence through repeated patterns in their lives. Public timekeeping inside cities supported this shared sense of schedule. Apart from sundials in plazas and portable versions in pockets, water clocks measured hours in shaded rooms. These devices dripped or flowed water from one container to another at a controlled rate. Marks on the receiving vessel showed how much time had passed. Courts and speeches could be timed. Allocations for speaking in assemblies might be measured in portions of a water clock cycle. The technology was imperfect. Changes in temperature and water pressure could affect flow rates. Yet the principle remained clear. Time was not just the feeling of the sun in the sky. It could be counted, sliced, and assigned. That mindset paved the way for later mechanical clocks and much later for digital timers that break days into scientifically precise segments. Standardization spread into measurements of length, volume, and weight. Units like the foot, the mile, the sextarius, and the libra became common references. Builders, merchants, and tax collectors all learned to use the same benchmarks. Measuring rods, graduated vessels, and scales turned these abstract units into practical tools. Once again, the real advance lay in coordination. When everyone agrees on what a mile or a pound is, projects can be planned and contracts enforced more easily. These measurement systems also allowed ambitious engineering projects to move from concept to reality. If you decide to build a road between two cities and you know the distance in standardized miles, you can estimate labor, materials, and time. If you want an aqueduct to deliver a certain volume of water, you can calculate channel size and slope in familiar units and tie imagination to stone. And on the surface, coins, inscriptions, calendars, water clocks, and measuring rods feel less dramatic than glowing furnaces or towering cranes. Yet they all point in the same direction. They turned a sprawling collection of peoples into a system that could coordinate actions across distances and generations. A farmer in a distant province sold grain using coins that matched standards tested in the capital. A judge read a legal formula carved in stone that matched a version kept in an archive hundreds of miles away. A builder set angles and heights using units that another builder could understand decades later in a different city. If you think of technology as anything that lets humans extend their abilities, these Roman tools qualified just as much as any machine. They extended memory through writing, and archives extended trust through coinage, and measured weights extended coordination through calendars and clocks. All of that created a kind of invisible framework that made the more obvious physical marvels possible. Spectacle in the Roman world was never just noise and blood, it was engineering on display. Whenever crowds packed into arenas and theatres, they were not only watching fighters, actors, and animals, they were also watching clever machinery at work, even if they did not realise it. Behind every gasp and cheer there was a layer of ropes, gears, sails, and water channels, quietly doing their job. Start with something as simple as shade. Sitting under the Mediterranean sun for hours is not fun even for the most devoted fan. Yet huge crowds filled open-air arenas without collapsing from heatstroke every afternoon. The trick was a massive fabric canopy system known as the velarium that stretched over many large amphitheatres. Imagine standing inside a stone oval that seats tens of thousands of people. Around the top rim, rows of masts rise like the spars on a forest of ships. From those masts, a web of ropes and pulleys holds enormous sections of canvas. Sailors from the Roman fleet, already used to rigging on ships, often operated the system. When the sun grew harsh, teams on the roof and outside the arena hauled on ropes to unfurl the velarium, pulling fabric panels into place so they floated high above the seats like a giant patchwork cloud. Getting this to work took careful planning. The fabric had to be strong enough to resist wind but light enough to raise. Ropes had to be anchored in ways that would not rip out stone blocks. Openings in the canopy allowed hot air and smoke to escape while still blocking direct sunlight from most of the audience. When wind picked up, crew members adjusted lines so the fabric did not turn into a giant sail that could tear loose and crash down. Below that floating roof, the building itself helped keep people comfortable and engaged. In theatres designed for plays and speeches, acoustic design was a quiet star. Builders knew even without modern physics that certain shapes carried sound better than others. The classic semicircular theatre design focused voices from the stage toward the audience like a gentle funnel. Rows of seats rose in carefully measured steps. The angle of those steps mattered. Too steep and climbing became dangerous too. Shallow and sound scattered. Stone benches and floor surfaces reflected sound instead of absorbing it. A single actor speaking in a normal voice at the center of the stage could be heard far up in the seating tiers, especially in good weather. Some designs experimented with resonant cavities and strategically placed openings that enhanced certain frequencies. Visual design followed similar principles. The seating bowl wrapped around the stage so that almost everyone saw the action from a decent angle. Background scenery painted on panels or built into the architecture framed actors in a way that highlighted movement and gesture. The layout did not happen by accident. Architects understood how people perceived sound and sight in large groups and built accordingly. Then there was the magic of stage machinery. Audiences loved surprises, and theatre crews learned how to deliver them with mechanical tricks. Trapdoors hidden in the floor opened to reveal characters rising from below or disappearing suddenly. Beneath, the stage workers waited with ropes and counterweights lifting platforms smoothly at the signal. From the audience's view, characters simply appeared where moments earlier there had been empty space. Other devices controlled scenery. Tall triangular prisms known as periactoires could stand at the edges of the stage, each face painted with a different background. With a quick turn, crews could switch from a city street to a forest or palace interior. Curtains and sliding panels added even more flexibility. All of this happened without electric motors. It relied on human timing, friction, and cleverly balanced weight. One of the most dramatic effects involved flying. Ropes, pulleys, and cranes placed out of sight allowed actors playing gods or heroes to descend from above or glide across the stage. To someone sitting below it, looked like supernatural intervention. To stagehands hidden in galleries, it looked like a lot of precise hauling and steady hands. The combination of these tricks turned static plays into living spectacles. If engineering on dry land impressed people, shows involving water pushed that feeling further. In some arenas, the floor could be flooded to create artificial lakes for staged naval battles. Watching ships clash in the middle of a city took serious infrastructure. Under the apparently solid surface, channels and reservoirs waited. Valves controlled by workers allowed water from nearby sources to rush in, filling the basin. Once the show ended, other outlets let water drain away into sewers or holding tanks. Balancing water depth was crucial. Too shallow and ships would scrape or get stuck. Too deep and docking, loading and safety became problems. Engineers had to calculate volumes and flow rates, then build channels and gates that handled those flows reliably. The crowd saw only waves and splashes. Underneath, a network of stone corridors and gates worked quietly. Water supported musical technology too. The hydraulis, a water-powered organ, turned flowing liquid into controlled sound. The instrument used water to regulate air pressure in pipes. As water entered a container and mixed with air, it forced air at a steady rate into channels that led to pipes. A player at a keyboard or set of sliders opened and closed those channels, sending air through different pipes to create notes and melodies. This design faced the same challenges as any pressure-based system. The flow of water had to be kept consistent. If it surged or dropped suddenly, the pitch and volume of the organ would wobble. Builders tuned water inlets, outlet openings, and container shapes to smooth out fluctuations. The result was an instrument that could hold a note far longer than the human breath-filling halls or open spaces with sustained music driven by nothing more than gravity and careful plumbing. Domestic and garden spaces also took advantage of simple hydraulic effects. Fountains that seemed to bubble and leap on their own were often powered by water stored at a higher level. Pressure from that height pushed liquid through pipes and out of nozzles into decorative basins. By constricting the openings or splitting the flow, designers created different spray patterns. No pumps whirred in the background. The pump was the height of the storage tank and the weight of the water itself. Some wealthy homes featured playful devices that responded when someone approached or activated a mechanism. A door might open smoothly with the help of a counterweight system hidden above the frame. A small figure could turn or pour water as liquid levels shifted inside its base. While not as complex as later clockwork automata, these tricks used the same principle: turn energy from falling water, moving weights, or compressed air into controlled motion. All these details show a pattern. Entertainment in this world was not just about performers. It was about constructing entire environments where architecture, hydraulics, and mechanics worked together. Spectators might come for wrestlers, gladiators, or tragic heroes, but they stayed and talked about awnings that rolled out overhead, voices that carried perfectly to the back row gods that appeared from nowhere, ships that floated on command, and music that seemed to rise up from inside stone itself. The technology driving those wonders did not speak in code or electricity. It spoke in ropes and counterweights, in slopes and valves, in the disciplined muscles of crews who learned exactly how fast to pull and when to release. The intelligence sat in the design of the systems and in the people trained to run them so smoothly that crowds focused only on the story unfolding before their eyes. Power and spectacle are easy to notice. What is harder to see is how Roman technology slipped into the tiny corners of daily life, turning ordinary actions into something quietly advanced. If you walked through a Roman home shop or street stall, with modern eyes you would keep bumping into details that feel strangely familiar. Start at the front door. Many Roman houses used lock and key systems that were surprisingly sophisticated. Instead of a simple bar dropped across a doorway, metal smiths crafted pin-tumbler locks that worked on a principle still used in a lot of modern keys. Inside the lock body, a row of pins rested in drilled holes. Insert the right key shape and it lifted those pins to just the right height. Only when everything lined up could the bolt slide back and open. Keys themselves came in all shapes. Some were small metal pieces worn on rings so owners would not lose them. Others were larger, used for gates or storerooms. The very idea that you could secure a space with a portable pattern of metal teeth was a quiet revolution. Personal property became something you could actually protect with more than a heavy rock against the door. Inside lighting solved another basic problem. Oil lamps stood everywhere, made from clay, bronze, or glass. Their design was simple. A reservoir held olive oil. A wick made from twisted fibers soaked it up. Once lit, the wick slowly burned, drawing fuel up from the reservoir and giving off a steady glow. Some lamps had multiple nozzles with several wicks for brighter light. Others were mounted on stands or suspended from ceilings so they could illuminate a wider area. Lamp makers decorated their products with patterns, figures, and scenes. A piece of functional technology doubled as a bit of art that visitors would see every evening. For wealthier households, glass lamps and lanterns added an extra layer of refinement. Transparent walls helped spread light more evenly and reduced smoke in the room. Glass itself marked another leap. Roman glassworkers developed techniques for blowing molten glass into bubbles that could be shaped into cups, bottles, and jars. Being able to see inside a container might sound trivial today, but in a world of pottery and metal it was quite special. You could check the colour and clarity of wine, watch the level of perfume oil drop, or admire the layering and stored ingredients. Some pieces of glassware likely acted as simple lenses when a small glass bead or bit of curved glass happens to magnify text or details people notice. There is evidence that certain crafted pieces helped readers with tired eyes or artisans working on fine carvings. They were not telescopes or microscopes, yet they played with light in ways that foreshadowed more complex optics. In another corner of the house, imagine a physician preparing tools. Roman medical kits contained scalpels, hooks, probes, forceps, and cautery instruments shaped with real precision. Handles balanced in the hand, blades tapered for different kinds of cuts, hooks curved in ways that matched how tissue moved. Surgeons had to work quickly and confidently, often on battlefields or in crowded rooms. Their tools needed to respond exactly as expected. For broken bones, splints and bandages applied with careful wrapping provided some measure of stability. For dislocations, practitioners used leverage and rotation with an understanding of joints built from long practice. The science behind their treatments was mixed with superstition, but the physical instruments show a clear command of metalworking and practical anatomy. Even something as humble as writing started to feel advanced when multiplied across society. We have already seen wax tablets and abacuses in busy markets. Bring that idea into the home, and you find children scratching letters into wax for practice scribes copying texts for private libraries, and household managers tracking expenses. Small ink pots, reed pens, and stacks of scrap material turned any corner into a miniature office. Graffiti on city walls offers another glimpse of how ordinary people used this ability. In many towns, walls were covered with messages scratched or painted by residents. They advertised gladiator games, announced rooms for rent, boasted of love affairs, insulted rivals, or made jokes. You could walk down a street and read snippets of opinion, gossip, and humour in a way that feels very close to scrolling through public comments. Taverns and inns functioned as information routers. Travellers brought stories from distant regions. Sailors repeated rumours from ports across the sea. On their walls you might find a mix of prices, slogans, and notes about upcoming events. In the noise of clinking cups and conversations, news spread across social groups that rarely visited official buildings. Behind these casual networks, a more formal flow of information ran along legal and business channels. Contracts written on papyrus or wooden tablets used standard formulas. Parties to an agreement might show up with their witnesses, dictate the terms to a scribe, and then seal the document with wax stamped by a personal signet ring. That ring carried a unique emblem carved into metal or stone. Pressed into soft wax, it created a tiny relief pattern that said, "In effect, this really came from me." Those seals acted like signatures and passwords combined. Break the seal and you showed that a letter had been opened. Forge one badly and the difference could be spotted. People learn to recognize familiar patterns on wax the way we learn to recognize a friend's handwriting or profile picture. Out in the countryside, farms were not simple patches of dirt. They were businesses shaped by tools, storage, and planning. Ploughs tipped with iron-cut soil deeper than wooden models. Iron hoes and pruning knives lasted longer and held sharper edges, making it easier to manage vines, orchards, and fields. Rural estates often had presses, granaries, and workshops built into their layout, turning raw produce into wine, oil, flour, and textiles on site. Water channels carried liquid both for crops and for simple machines. In some regions, smaller versions of water wheels turned millstones or lifted water in mounted buckets along circular chains. These devices eased the mental and physical load on workers. Instead of hauling every bucket by hand, a person could walk along a tread or push a mechanism to move the same volume with less strain. In port towns, technology shaped the shoreline. Harbours needed docks that did not fall apart after the first storm. Concrete filled timber frames to form solid piers. Breakwaters reached out into the sea, breaking waves so that harbours stayed calmer. Cranes and ramps handled bulky cargo such as marble blocks, amphorae, full of olive oil or crates of grain. Navigation aids like simple lighthouses or beacons helped ships find their way after dark using elevated fires that could be seen from far offshore. Across all these spaces there is a pattern worth noticing. Romans were constantly layering small improvements onto everyday tasks. Locks protected rooms instead of just putting up bars. Glass made it easier to see and store. Lamps turned night into usable time indoors. Medical tools made treatment more precise. Writing and sealing made agreements more durable. Agricultural devices cut effort on farms. Harbour engineering made trade more reliable. Individually, none of these inventions looks as dramatic as a towering aqueduct or a colossal arena. Together they turn the world of an ordinary Roman citizen into something that feels a lot closer to modern life than many people expect. There were still sharp limits, of course. Illness risk and inequality ran through society, yet the technologies supporting daily routines were more advanced, more interconnected and more carefully designed than the stereotype of a rough ancient world suggests. When you picture that world, it might help to imagine a merchant closing a metal lock on a storeroom, checking a wax tablet for orders, counting coins on an abacus, lighting an oil lamp near a glass bottle of wine, and then stepping out into a street where graffiti announces tomorrow's games, and a distant bath complex sends a plume of steam into the fading light. That is not a random collection of old objects. It is a tiny snapshot of an ecosystem of tools working together. Imagine waking up one morning in a world where all of this has gone quiet. No aqueduct humming above your head, no bath complex warming its marble halls, no cranes lifting stone, no organised fire brigades, no messenger network pounding along stone roads. The buildings are still there for a while, but the knowledge that runs them has started to flicker. That is what happened when the structures that held the Roman system together began to crack. It did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. It thinned, frayed, and peeled away in pieces as political authority shifted, trade routes shrank, and local communities turned inward. The result was not just the fall of an empire, it was a downgrade in everyday technology that would take centuries to recover. Picture a town that once sat on a major road. Couriers used to race through it with official messages. Merchants stopped along the way, and maintenance crews patched the paving. As central budgets and control weakened, those crews stopped arriving. Stones cracked and slipped, drainage ditches filled in. Carts still used the route for a time, but travel slowed and detours grew common. Eventually, sections of the road faded into dirt paths, again swallowed by fields and brush. In cities, large public baths became harder to support. Aqueduct arches still marched across valleys, but sections collapsed without repair. Furnaces in bath complexes sucked up wood that local forests could no longer supply at the same rate once trade and organisation faltered. Heating systems sat cold more often. Pools dried or turned stagnant. Buildings that once shone with polished stone and moving water became shells rented out as storage or broken up for reusable materials. Specialists who understood intricate systems had fewer reasons to pass on their skills. A master glass worker who once produced fine vessels for a wide market might find demand shrinking. The next generation might learn enough to make simpler pieces, but not enough to maintain the most advanced techniques. A builder trained to calculate long aqueduct gradients might end up working only on small local projects where such precision seems unnecessary. In that kind of environment, technology does not stop existing, it just loses layers. People still build, still farm, still trade, yet the complexity of what they build, farm and trade steps down a notch. A bath becomes a wash basin, a road becomes a track, a theatre becomes a quarry for stone. The physical remains of the old systems sit in the background like rusted servers in a warehouse. No one can quite figure out how to restart. For a long time, some of the more subtle Roman achievements felt mysterious even to later engineers. Medieval builders looked at the dome of the Pantheon and respected its ambition without necessarily copying it. Harbour designers faced the same violent seas that Roman concrete had tamed, but often with materials that crumbled more quickly. Knowledge did not disappear everywhere at once, yet it no longer formed a connected empire spanning conversation. Fast forward to the present and the contrast becomes uncomfortable. Technology today moves information at nearly the speed of light, but often builds physical things that are not meant to last. Phone batteries fail after a few years, software support ends. Bridges and buildings are sometimes designed with shorter service lives because constant replacement fits into certain economic assumption. Roman engineers working with slower communication and fewer tools often took the opposite approach. They expected their roads, aqueducts, and public buildings to outlive them by generations. They planned for maintenance, but also chose materials and designs that would hold up under abuse, weather, and neglect. Many of those choices worked so well that pieces of their world still function long after their names have been forgotten. There is another contrast that cuts even deeper. Modern systems rely on electricity as their lifeblood. Turn that flow off, and entire layers of society lock up. Traffic lights, pumps, communication networks, elevators, payment systems all freeze. Roman systems leaned on gravity heat and human labour arranged in elegant patterns. Remove central authority and they suffer, but some core functions keep going as long as water still flows downhill and fire still burns. Think of an aqueduct feeding a city. As long as the intake remains clear and the channel unbroken water continues to arrive with no need for a control room. Think of radiant floors warmed by a furnace and hollow spaces in stone. So long as someone can light a fire and feed it, wood heat spreads through the building. The design carries intelligence within the stone itself. The closest modern equivalent to their integrated approach might be the invisible lattice of cable satellites and routers people call the internet. It connects distant places so they can share information quickly. It standardizes formats and protocols so messages can be understood from one end of the world to the other. It shapes daily life without being easily seen. Rome did something similar with stone roads, coinage, writing measurements, and messenger relays. A letter stamped with a seal and sent along a paved route moved more slowly than an email. Yet for its time it sat on the same frontier between isolation and connection. A coin stamped with an emperor's face and a fixed weight kept trade coherent just as much as a digital currency balance does now. An inscription carved in stone and posted in a forum served as a stable reference in the same way that a public website does for modern laws or policies. There is an irony hidden in all of this. People today sometimes talk about history as if it were a straightforward climb from primitive to advanced, like a staircase, where each step lifts everyone higher. The Roman world challenges that story, shows that societies can reach impressive heights of integrated technology, lose large portions of it, and then spend centuries climbing back up. This does not mean the past was better in every way. Modern medicine, communication, and scientific understanding reach far beyond anything available in that older world. The point is more humbling. Progress is not guaranteed. It is a pattern of choices, habits, and shared knowledge that has to be maintained, renewed, and taught again and again. So when someone smiles confidently and says that people in the past lived in darkness while the present owns the light, there is a quiet response waiting in stone arches and buried pipes. It whispers that human beings 2,000 years ago figured out how to heat floors, move water across mountains, keep thousands of people safe in huge venues, record and transmit information across continents, and build materials that heal themselves while waves pound them. The real question is not whether that world was more advanced than this one. The real question is why so much of what it achieves still feels surprising. Maybe it is because the ruins tend to look silent and empty at first glance. Maybe it is because it is easier to picture gladiators and emperors than surveyors and furnace operators. Or maybe it is because acknowledging how clever they were forces people to rethink what counts as truly modern. If there is a lesson hiding inside those old bricks and channels, it might be this. Technology is not just screens and circuits. It is whatever lets people extend their reach through space and time. The Romans did that with stone, bronze, water, fire, and disciplined work. They built a world where information, people, heat, and goods moved along invisible rules as real as any code. Standing in the present, surrounded by devices that can fail with a dead battery or an expired update, it is worth remembering that once upon a time someone mixed volcanic ash and lime-carved channels into hills, laid out roads with a simple cross-shaped tool, tuned a stage so a whisper carried to the back row, and assumed that all of it would still be running long after their own names had turned to dust.